Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
This week, from Russia with Love, the Russian president visits California and tours Silicon Valley. There will be a runoff in the special election to fill the state Senate seat left vacant by Lieutenant Governor Maldonado. Some of the initiatives that have qualified so far for the November ballot. And tough choices in Oakland over cuts to the police department to balance the city budget. Also, new hope for those infected with hepatitis C. Father of biodiversity E.O. Wilson on his first novel, and a preview of the famed Fisher collection of contemporary art at SFMOMA.
It's a collection that celebrates sensuality and vision. It makes your eyes and even your physical body respond.
And on Food and Wine this week, what's old is new again as wine makes its way to your glass. Coming up next. Good evening. I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. We will be with you for an hour tonight. Joining me on our news panel, Mathai Kurugula, staff writer with the San Francisco Chronicle on cuts to Oakland's police department. John Weldermuth, also with the Chronicle on initiatives qualified for the November ballot. Josh Richmond, legal and political affairs reporter with the Oakland Tribune on the special election. And starting with Carla Marinucci, political reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle on President Medvedev's trip to California. So, Carla, we know there was one big reason why he came. Tell us about that.
Silicon Valley was the big reason, and it was just an amazing trip this week, I think, for the Russian president. Out of Cisco Systems, he got $1 billion investment pledge. He started a Twitter account. What else do you need to know about that? He got an Apple iPhone 4 from Steve Jobs. I mean, this was all a trip, a message about how collaboration between California and Russia and to focus on Silicon Valley, I think, was really, really interesting. I was at the Fairmont when the president arrived with Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it was just a celebratory moment, but it was so interesting. You had George Shultz there, who was Secretary of State, of course, during the Cold War. And anybody who remembers anything about the Cold War, can look at this with wonder. A week where we had a Russian warship in the bay and the Russian president toasting, champagne with the governor of California. And at the same time, in the same week, a Russian conglomerate putting up money to save a California state park. I mean, times have changed.
So, Carla, was this private industry at work or a diplomatic coup on the part of the Obama administration? Who carried the water here?
And I think talking to Governor Schwarzenegger, I think he also deserves credit for this as well. He's one who has sort of advanced the cause of international trade, and he clearly was very proud pushing this. President Medvedev's visit to Silicon Valley, he also announced a trade mission to Russia. But then there was this unusual collaboration between one of the richest men in the world, Victor Vekselberg, and he has a group called the Renova Group, and he put up money to save Fort Ross, which is a very important Russian historical site. California was going to have to close this down. It has already been closed down several days a week, didn't have the money. The place was in the red, almost $1 million. And this was the first time in state history that a foreign nonprofit group came to sort of essentially bail California out of its fiscal crisis and keep a state park open. In some ways, some people said that was very controversial. There are groups out there saying, shouldn't Californians be doing this ourselves? I mean, what's next? To have Carlos Slim, the richest billionaire in Mexico, come forward and put up money to save the missions when those go under? I mean,
But isn't it interesting, Carla, that something like that, when you're talking about Fort Ross, something that a lot of people in California recognize and everything, that's kind of almost a people-to-people type of job, rather than, you know, Silicon Valley and big million-dollar investments and everything. Fort Ross is something that people can really relate to, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, when the Russian government heard that this park was going to be closed either several days a week or shuttered because California didn't have the money, they actually sent their ambassador to the site. They started opening talks with the Schwarzenegger administration, and that's when the Russian billionaire came forward and said, let's see what we can do, let's form this foundation. The same billionaire is involved with the president of Russia in trying to open a Silicon Valley development in Russia, and that's where the Silicon Valley connection came in too.
What do you think this says about what Medvedev is trying to do with the new Russia, you know, in terms of redirecting the economy over
I mean,
there?
it's a really interesting time in Russia, I think. As somebody who I covered actually the fall of the Soviet Union, the 1991 in Russia, and to see the kind of entrepreneurship, the development, the huge press corps that was with the Russian president from Russia, it shows the changing times. This is a guy who's 44, around the same age of Obama. He's making the point that Russia needs to diversify its economic base away from oil. It's got the infrastructure from the Cold War days. It has now a whole new generation of entrepreneurs and money, but it doesn't have the know-how that Cisco Systems or Twitter or Apple has. And that's why he went right to the home base. And to get a $1 billion pledge out of John Chambers at Cisco was really important. The Twitter people also said they were going to study, as did Steve Jobs, in terms of making collaborations with tech people in Russia and here. And this trade mission that Schwarzenegger announced also, he said, means jobs for California and for Russia. So,
well, a new initiative there.
yeah, absolutely.
Certainly a new initiative.
I think we'll be hearing more about
it. It was actually interesting to see Russian sailors walking the streets of San Francisco.
Yeah, no question.
So initiatives, John, that's your beat here. We certainly have enough of them coming at us from on the ballot coming up in November, and some of them really probably a very high interest.
Yeah, there's going to be there'll be 10 on the ballot. The deadline was yesterday, and we ended up with 10, and there are a whole bunch of things that are going to be interesting. First and foremost, obviously, the one everybody's heard of is marijuana legalization is going to be there. But you're also going to be voting on an $11.1 billion water bond, which is just huge, and it's going to be very divisive. With right now, we have business and the governor on one side, we have the Sierra Club and a lot of unions on the other. Then you move down the list. There's a ballot measure that'll put an $18 surcharge on the vehicle license fees. And in return, you get to go to the state parks for free with the money from that vehicle license fee going to state parks. You get a couple of redistricting measures. One will extend 2008's Prop 11 to Congress, and the other one, which is supported by the Democrats, will eliminate Prop 11 entirely and give redistricting back to the legislature. So there's a lot of stuff out there.
So how much of this is actually a reform of how the way California government runs, and how much of it is not?
It depends what you mean by reform, and that's, you know, one person's reform is another person's really bad idea. But yeah, a lot of it is very much aimed at the way California runs. I mean, for example, the governor was threatening to close the state parks a year or two ago. Well, you have one group saying, okay, let's raise money by increasing the vehicle license fee and save those state parks. The redistricting, both sides you have out there. You have a couple of last year in the budget, as part of the budget negotiations, everybody agreed on some business measures, pro-business measures. Well, the CTA put up $2 million to say, let's get rid of those measures before they even take place.
John, let's talk about the pod thing, because I think this is the one where John Burton, the chairman of the Democratic Party, has said he hopes that that's going to bring out the young voters in November. Who is that going to bring out, and how is it looking right now? This is one the whole nation is going to watch.
Yeah, they will. I guess the numbers show here and just about everywhere else that it's basically split. They may have 48% in favor, 48% not in favor. The question, as in all elections, is who shows up to vote. And
but isn't it also who has the money to mount the television campaign that usually
for example, the Oakland man that put up the money to get the get the money on the ballot, put up about $1 million, says that's it, he's done. They're going to raise other money. So yeah, and as far as young people coming out, that's, everybody always says this is what's going to bring young people out.
Who's going to fight that measure?
It's going to be law enforcement,
Right.
and that's a very, very tough one to beat in California.
And then, John, you've got one measure to change the legislative vote requirement for a budget to a simple majority instead of 2/3, but then another one to raise the threshold to 2/3 for state levies and charges. So again, like two things at odds with each other, basically,
well,
right?
if you look at any initiative in California, the first thing you're going to have, the first question you ask is who benefits? And nobody's putting up money for initiatives unless they think that there's something, what are they going to make? What are they going to get out of it? So you have the 2/3 vote, you have the unions and the Democrats, state Democratic parties put a lot of money into that, figuring that they can get their own budgets through without having to worry about Republicans.
Did we talk about AB 32?
AB 32, we should talk about that too. That is the greenhouse gas measure, which has kind of been Governor Schwarzenegger's tour de force. That's what he's counting on for his legacy. And we have a group here, a number of groups led by the oil companies, Valero with $1 million and Tesoro with about $500,000, saying, okay, let's put it up and say, let's suspend it. They want to suspend it until California's unemployment rate drops to 5.5% for 4 consecutive quarters.
When was the last time that happened?
It's been a while, and they're not taking too hard a measure there. They're pretty sure that they're going to be safe for a while if that passes.
Well, this is Texas money.
It's oil money in general, but certainly Texas money in this case. But I think before it ends, you're going to see a lot of the California oil companies out there too.
So what about the opportunities for the water bond in spite of all of the economic problems that we have?
Water bonds in a tough situation. The numbers I saw, and there hasn't been a lot of polling, but it showed that 35% was in favor going into the early stuff. $11 billion is an awful lot of money, and people are going to say that is going to require the state to pony up a lot of cash for a lot of years, and it's going to be a tough sell, especially since there's going to be a lot of groups on the other side saying, don't pass it.
The whole thing is just, this is going to be such a long ballot. That's the question.
It seems a lot of this is a rebellion against legislative moves, and the legislative moves are driven by the fact that you need a 2/3 vote to get a budget passed. So is it just that we've come full circle, or we're coming full circle, so that now the legislature doesn't work because of 2/3 and not getting that through, and now we have these ballot measures where it doesn't work unless you can find some money to promote your idea?
Well, it all comes down to, somebody has to get politics back into government. Politics, is, they used to say, is the art of the possible, the ability to accept half a loaf, the ability to negotiate. Nobody wants to negotiate now. Everybody says, here's my position, there's your position, and there's no middle ground. It's warfare all the time. And the 2/3 you're going to see a very, very late budget this year. It's going to go through most of the summer, and nobody wants to give. And until you can get to the point where people are willing to say, hey, let's do what's best for California, you're not going to go anywhere. It's stalemate.
Thinking about deals, our next story sort of comes out of a deal made in the legislature. That was the lieutenant governor made a deal so that he could be elevated to where he is now. But in his district, they're having trouble coming through with the majority on a vote to replace him.
Yeah, we're going to have a runoff. Actually, not a runoff, a special general election, because nobody in this week's special election broke the 50% mark. So what you've got, your major party candidates are Assemblyman Sam Blakesley, Republican from San Luis Obispo, against former Assemblyman John Laird from Santa Cruz. Blakesley finished less than 1,000 votes short of of breaking the 50% mark out of 146,000 plus votes cast. So he was very close, but not quite close enough. So now we get to go back and do it all over again on August 17th. All of this came about because when Governor Schwarzenegger nominated Abel Maldonado to be lieutenant governor, the Democrats in the legislature sort of messed around for a while, and they wouldn't confirm him at first, and then he had to be renominated, and then they finally confirmed him. They had waited until it had come to a date when the governor could consolidate this election with November's election. That's what the Democrats wanted, because they know they'll have better turnout then. The governor said, oh, no. We're going to have special elections in the summer. $3.5 million worth of special elections, but special elections nonetheless. It's a huge district. It spans from Santa Clara County all the way down into Santa Barbara County. You got a very diverse sort of area there. It does have a Democratic registration edge, but again, with the turnout depressed in these summertime elections, Sam Blakeslee was able to get very close, not quite over that threshold. So,
okay, but it does have a Democratic edge, as you mentioned. 7
Yes,
points. That's no small thing. So shouldn't John Laird be able to take that over the top?
well, there are a couple of. First of all, turnout in California typically favors Democrats, heavier turnout. And without something to draw people to the polls, it comes down in some part to money. Sam Blakeslee was able to muster more money, both in his own campaign and through independent expenditures than Laird was. Laird is openly gay, which is fine in the Santa Cruz part of the district. There are more conservative parts of the district that may have some overt or covert problem with that, so that probably plays into it as well.
But isn't Blakeslee a former oil executive in the time of BP?
Indeed he is, and that's really what a lot of the Laird campaign became about, painting Sam Blakeslee as a former oil company worker and trying to link him to big oil and the whole drill baby drill mentality, which ultimately didn't seem to work. It certainly wasn't enough to put Laird ahead. So now one wonders what's going to happen, what the message is going to be from now until August.
It's kind of funny when you talk about the fact that, Governor Schwarzenegger made a political decision to hold this election like this because the whole thing revolves around a political decision.
Totally.
One reason that the Democrats confirmed Maldonado was to open up that seat because it's really important to the Democrats.
It is really
isn't it?
important. The Democrats believe that if they can win this seat, and if then they can turn their attention to the Senate, the 12th Senate district, where Jeff Denham is termed out and he's going up, he's running for Congress, they believe that if they can get if they can win both those seats, they then have the 2/3 majority in the Senate, which is very powerful for budget votes. Of course, they're still 3 votes short in the Assembly, but they'll cross that bridge when they come to it.
And how long has it been since any party has had a 2/3 majority?
Not in recent memory, which is why we have a structural deficit and all of the wonderful things that make California government so incredibly interesting here week after week. It doesn't seem likely, certainly, that those 3 assembly seats would come over to the Democrats anytime soon, given the gerrymandering of the state. And of course, we'll see if Prop 11 stays in place, given the ballot initiative we just talked about. Maybe there'll be redistricting in a couple of years, meaningful redistricting. Maybe there won't. Who knows?
You mentioned the drill baby drill issue, and this district does include Santa Barbara, where this is a very big issue. Is it possible the Democrats, it seems, want to take that drill baby drill theme against the Republicans all the way up and down the line in the state?
It seems like a winner because, public outrage is obviously very high against BP and by extension, against the oil industry. And yet when push came to shove, when the commercials hit the airwaves, when the voters went to the ballots, it was not enough to give Laird the edge. Blakeslee goes into this next election, the special general, with a clear edge. And so Laird has a seriously uphill battle to fight.
Mathai, you're dealing with a story that has a different base, and that is the base of local governments having challenges with trying to meet their budgets. In Oakland, there's a problem with money to keep the police force where it is, with that city's reputation for having a bad record of violent crime. So what is Oakland going to do?
It's the paradox of Oakland. Oakland has, for a long time, been defined by the crime issue, and they've always kept police salaries relatively high because they've thought that they wanted to attract the best cops for a long time. But that's the paradox: is you pay the most, you're paying the most for cops because it's a dangerous city, but because you pay so much, you have fewer cops. And the city, the budget crisis is affecting cities all across the state, but police is really at the center of the city's municipal government identity. And it was starting to impede on all the other things that make a city: parks, swimming pools, senior centers. If you cut all of the parks and rec, and if you cut all of the swimming pools, and you cut all of the libraries, you still couldn't make up for the budget deficit in Oakland. So they were faced with this choice that the council felt like they had no choice but to cut. And they cut 80 police officers, which is 10% of the department, which is no small thing in the city with the highest violent crime rate in the state. Oakland is really coming to grips with, what should the city really be about and how much should it be about police?
Part of this whole issue too this week, I know, has been the role of Mayor Dellums. He went ballistic on a TV reporter this week that made some news and showed up at a press conference, I know. I mean, has that played into his role or lack of it in the formation of the city budget? How much is that?
There's definitely an absence of leadership, and Councilmember Jane Bruner has done a lot of work, and along with some of her colleagues, to try and craft a budget. But the questions of leadership are bigger almost, and he didn't, as far as I can tell, have much of an impact on shaping the budget. But City Administrator Dan Lindheim and council members have worked very hard at it. But it's almost a non-factor what Dellums' role was.
Wasn't though when Mayor Dellums came in, there was a whole cry, 100 new cops, I think was it, and lots of publicity around that. Were those 100, are they the ones now, or in terms of numbers, being affected by this cut?
Some of them, we don't know exactly who the cops are, but there's a natural attrition. They went all the way up to 837 officers in 2008, and now they're down, after this layoffs, they'll be down to 696, but they were down to 776 through the attrition. Yeah, I mean, raising the number of police on the force was important because Dellums has made that his central policy goal for the city.
But when you talk to people in the city, this is really something that hits them where they live. I mean, you see the violence and everything and say, well, let's take cops away. What are people saying about this, not just the politicians? Especially
since one of the proposals is to add a $300 parcel tax onto every house. I mean, a lot of people in Oakland can't afford that. Is that going to pass?
Well, there's two different ballot measures. One is to suspend a voter mandate to have a minimum of 739 officers to get $20 million in parcel tax revenue. That's probably going to pass, and if that passes, they would lay off another 27 officers. If that fails and the parcel tax fails, they would lay off 120 officers. So Oakland's in a very precarious position. But as far as what residents are talking about, I think it's all over the map. I've been to community meetings. I've been to City Hall. I mean, there are a lot of residents who feel like, yeah, they actually care about their libraries. If it means that some police are cut, that's okay. That there's things that police cannot decimate the rest of the city, is what several people said at the council meeting on Thursday.
Is there still some negotiating to be done with the OPOA that could avert some of these layoffs? Or?
Absolutely. The police union, Oakland Police Officers Association, is going to negotiate with some of the council members and the city administration on Sunday and Monday, and that could avert some of the layoffs. But it's really the two ballot measures in the fall are really going to define how many layoffs ultimately come through in Oakland.
Well, my thanks to all of you for joining me tonight. All very interesting stories. And now some other stories from the news this week. The defense attorney in the murder trial of Oakland journalist Chauncey Bailey has requested that the trial be moved from Alameda County because of publicity. Yusef Bey IV, the former head of Your Black Muslim Bakery, and one of his associates are charged with the killing of the Oakland Post editor. Setting the stage for a showdown in Sacramento, Governor Schwarzenegger said that he will cut the salaries of more than 200,000 state workers to minimum wage if lawmakers don't reach a budget agreement by July 1st. Comptroller John Chung, who issues the paychecks, said that he will defy that order. Whooping cough has been declared an epidemic in California and could break a 50-year record for the number of infections. There were 910 recorded cases of the highly contagious disease as of June 15th. The California Public Health Department recommends a vaccination for children and boosters for adults who care for infants. Legislation to ban the controversial open carry of unloaded handguns in public places by ordinary citizens passed the state Senate Public Safety Committee. The bill has already passed by the Assembly and is expected to be voted on by the full Senate in August. and a reminder that tolls on state-owned bridges are going up on July 1st. Coming up later, a conversation with biologist E.O. Wilson, the Fisher Collection at SFMOMA, and Food and Wine this week.
Maintain quality, freshness, which is very, very important, as well as bring a wine nobody would ever try in a regular bottle of wine because of the unfined and filtered aspect.
Hepatitis C, a blood-borne viral infection that attacks the liver, isn't often talked about, so it may be a surprise to learn that it affects more than 3 million people in this country. This story from KQED's Quest series show how Bay Area researchers are seeking new treatments.
Shirley Barger was enchanted with San Francisco when she moved here more than 40 years ago. But over time, walking through the city she loved became more and more difficult.
I just was tired all the time. I had lots of muscle aches, joint pain, and it didn't seem to me I was old enough to have quite that much pain.
She was in her early 50s when her doctor told her she had hepatitis C, a diagnosis that sent shockwaves through her life.
I completely freaked out for a few days. I had every possible symptom of the late stages, so I was very worried.
The fear that accompanies a hepatitis C diagnosis is well-founded. There's no vaccine and no reliable cure. The virus attacks the liver. It's the leading cause of cirrhosis or scarring of the liver and can lead to death.
Hepatitis C is the #1 cause for patients needing liver transplant, and along with hepatitis B is the #1 cause for patients to develop liver cancer.
You can't live without a liver. It generates proteins and other vital substances and cleanses the body of toxins and bacteria. Worldwide, as many as 160 million people have hepatitis C or HCV. And in the United States, an estimated 4 million people have the virus, 3 times the number living with HIV. The disease claims 12,000 American lives every year. And while the rate of new infections has dropped, the number of people showing symptoms and needing medical care is expected to increase dramatically over the next decade.
It is a huge epidemic and it affects everybody. So it is a local as well as a global problem.
Hepatitis C is called the silent epidemic because a person can go for decades before symptoms surface. 75% of people with the virus have no idea they're infected. So while the rate of new infections has dropped, Bay Area scientists are racing to find a cure because the number of people showing symptoms and needing medical care is expected to increase dramatically over the next decade. Once they've been diagnosed, many patients, like Alan Franciscus, don't know how they contracted the disease.
I have a lot of the risk factors for it. For example, I've had operations since I was 13 years old, and we know that prior to 1992 that the blood supply wasn't screened.
Hepatitis C is spread through blood-to-blood contact. It can be passed from mother to child during birth. Sharing a razor or toothbrush with an infected person or getting tattooed or pierced with unsterilized tools can result in infection. Basically, any exposure to infected blood can put a person at risk.
Can you take a deep breath for me?
But the most common association with disease exposure is sharing hypodermic needles with an infected person.
I think that I contracted hepatitis C in 1969. I can remember 3 times when I experimented with injectable drugs during that year. And it was a stupid thing to do, but I was 18 and 19 years old at the time.
Initial studies found high rates of hepatitis C among men with HIV, and that led many to assume the virus was passed through sexual activity. But current research shows that sexual transmission of hepatitis C is possible, but rare. To add to the confusion, the symptoms of hepatitis C can be similar to symptoms associated with other illnesses.
Prior to being diagnosed, for about 2 years, I was having some really heavy fatigue, the kind that is really debilitating.
Are you noticing any swelling of your legs or your knees?
Fatigue is the most universal of the symptoms, which range from jaundice and slow blood clotting to flu-like symptoms, nausea, and rashes. Dr. Todd Frederick follows more than 1,000 patients with hepatitis C at the California Pacific Medical Center in San Francisco.
They're from all walks of life. These are CEOs of companies who got infected when they were 18, or, homeless people that really are still down and out.
While people with hepatitis C cross the spectrum of society, certain populations in the United States are particularly at risk. African Americans have the highest incidence of hepatitis C and the lowest response rates to medication available today. They're followed by Latinos. An estimated 34% of prisoners in the U.S. are infected with the virus, and in some California prisons, it's more than 80%. The majority of Americans afflicted with the disease are baby boomers. While current treatments are often ineffective and can be intolerable, researchers say there's great hope for developing remedies to treat and prevent the disease without side effects. Dr. Jeffrey Glenn and his team of researchers at the Stanford University School of Medicine are looking for compounds that will prevent the hepatitis C virus from replicating. And at the Gladstone Institutes at UCSF, Dr. Melanie Ott and her staff are doing groundbreaking research on the relationship between the virus and fat droplets in the liver that could soon lead to a cure. While scientists rush to find a cure, patients, healthcare providers, and advocates are working on prevention. Public education efforts are badly needed.
Hepatitis C is not talked about very much. There is a stigma attached, and I think that's very unfortunate. Hepatitis C is a disease. It's not a moral judgment.
Alan Franciscus runs a small organization, HCV Advocate, based in San Francisco. It receives millions of hits on its website from people looking for information and support. Alan, along with Shirley and Dr. Frederick, are part of the San Francisco Task Force on Hepatitis C, established by Mayor Gavin Newsom in November 2009. They're charged with crafting comprehensive policy and funding recommendations for fighting the epidemic in the city.
We know that hepatitis C is a huge problem in San Francisco. And the hope was that we can come up with an effective plan to deal with identification, management, and treatment of hepatitis C.
The challenge is daunting, and the fight is woefully underfunded. At the same time, efforts to find a cure are paying off.
We have a good chance of working for a treatment that will clear the virus forever. And that, for a scientist, is just enormously exciting.
Renowned biologist and author E.O. Wilson recently visited the Bay Area to raise money for the development of a new online science textbooks and to promote his first novel, Anthill. KQED's Quest series producer Amy Miller sat down to talk with Wilson about his book and his lifelong passion for the natural world.
Edward Osborne Wilson is one of the most important biologists of our time. He's a prolific writer and leading researcher in evolutionary biology. He's been called the father of biodiversity after first describing the concept in 1985. And he's dedicated much of his life and work to environmental conservation and science education. As the world's foremost authority on ants, Wilson has discovered hundreds of new species. His lifelong study of ants culminated in the definitive publication on the topic, for which he was awarded his second Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. He's recently published his first fiction novel, called Anthill, which is based closely on his own life growing up as a young naturalist in rural Alabama. Tell me about your new book, Anthill.
It's about a family in the southern, rather backwater city of Mobile, Alabama, as they pass through 3 generations. With the civil rights revolution having succeeded and its memories beginning to fade, although it's still a long way to go, the South now faces a new crisis of which most Southerners are unaware, which is how to manage the land before they destroy it. So the human side of the story is about the coming of age of a young boy that grows up in the midst of this. Young Raphael, an only child, is living with his two parents in the little town of Clayville. I've based Clayville intimately upon my own knowledge of South Alabama. Young Raphael is able to go out in a short distance to a rare area of still relatively untouched southern forest. He acquires a deep knowledge of the area, becomes bonded to it. And then upon learning that, like most of the rest of the South, in that area and particularly, it's about to go under development, he vows to find the way to save his beloved forest. And then the rest of the novel plays out as the bitter conflicts between classes, between families, between developers and the rising conservation movement in that part of the world. And through all these struggles, Raphael provides, through his college senior thesis, a detailed description of the ants he has studied at Lake Nockabee. That becomes the Ant Chronicles, and that is the part that provides for the reader the first extended view of how ants colonies are born, live, die in conflict and struggle for survival, as seen by the ants themselves.
Why did you want to tell the story from the ants' perspective?
Because it's never been done before. The terrestrial world at the level of little things is owned by the ants. Ants alone make up upwards of 2/3 of the weight of all insects in most parts of the world. They dominate the environment, and they do it by complex social behavior. Now, ants themselves are very bizarre. First of all the members of the society are female. The males are bred up by the colony for a very short period of time. They only have one function, and that's to mate with new virgin queens. As they age, ants change the form of labor. And the first thing they do, they serve as nurses for the queen, for the little grub-like larvae. And then as they grow older, they start moving to the outside. They repair the nest. They stand guard. And finally, as they get considerably older, they become foragers, which is a high-risk activity since a large percentage of ants are killed on every expedition taken out. So they are willing to throw away their lives. And as a result, they are also the warriors. And that's why I've generalized the difference between people and ants as whereas we send our young men to war, ants send their old ladies.
What is the best thing people can do to protect the natural world?
We've been paying a disproportionate amount of time on the physical world, climate change, exhaustion of non-renewable resources, pollution, so on. We got the message. We're doing something there, beginning to do it. But we're sort of forgotten a lot about the living world is disappearing. And I believe that there should be a great deal more effort put into exploring the living world. We know maybe no more than 10% of the species that actually exist. And we need to know a lot more about that in order to plan a sustainable world.
You are a notorious optimist. Given the escalating rate of climate change and the seemingly endless string of environmental catastrophes like the Gulf oil spill, are you still optimistic?
I used to describe myself as a cautious optimist. Right now I'm describing myself as a scared optimist. I know we can pull this off. That is, we can save most of the rest of life, but it's going to take a very considerable change in our attitudes, maybe even our worldview, and considerable advances, which are to our advantage anyway as a people and individually, in education and science and technology and public policy. We have to make a much stronger effort in all those fields. And I'm beginning to worry about whether we have the will to do it. We're at a crisis in education right now. The American public especially has to have a better grasp of science and technology to meet as the electorate and for guidance to their political leaders. The media then have fallen away. Environmental reporting is on the decline nationally. In fact, we're in sort of a crisis at the present time of public understanding. How do we solve it? Well, I don't have a single simple formula, but my answer then, if I had to give a short one, is by paying attention and making the effort for the good of us all.
The thoughts of biologist E.O. Wilson. GAP's founder and San Francisco native Don Fisher passed away last year, just days before he and his wife Doris finalized an extraordinary gift of their family's contemporary art collection to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Today, the museum unveiled a sample of the remarkable collection to the public for the very first time.
It is a kind of civic duty on behalf of people who have the money to make a donation like this. But, you know, no one can impose that duty. Fortunately, the Fishers did feel that responsibility because they could easily have dispersed the collection in various ways and cashed out big time.
Don and Doris Fisher, who founded the SF-based international apparel company The Gap, started collecting graphic art prints in 1969 to decorate the company offices. They were spurred on by friends' advice and their own taste for colorful work. As The Gap grew into a multi-billion-dollar company, they were able to start amassing hundreds of pieces of art.
The Fishers collected very personally, very intuitively. They didn't have an advisor, a consultant. This came out of their own personal passion. They visited galleries constantly, saw exhibitions whenever they could. And Don and Doris really did this together. The Fisher collection, most people involved with contemporary art would say is one of the most important private collections in the world.
The Fisher collection spans several genres of post-war art, including pop art, American minimalism, and contemporary German painting and sculpture. The Fishers collected well-known artists in depth, such as Andy Warhol, Sol LeWitt, Alexander Calder, and Gerhard Richter.
There is a very specific set of qualities to the collection. The works tend to be very bold. There's a graphic immediacy to a lot of the work. It's a collection that celebrates sensuality and vision. It makes your eyes and even your physical body respond.
The exhibition Calder to Warhol, Introducing the Fisher Collection, is a teaser of 160 works, only a small fraction of the 1,100 in the collection. One of the largest shows ever mounted by the museum, it will take up the 4th and 5th floors as well as the roof garden.
Calder was the artist that Don most passionately loved and was engaged with.
The Calders get banged over the years and they get chipped, they rust, they get dirty, and here we have an opportunity, they're all down, and we can, side by side, we can work on them and get them ready. And the works then come to life again. It's quite wonderful.
There are 45 works by Calder in the collection. And Don just loved the creative imagination of Calder. He said he loved the fact that he worked with such simple materials. They were inexpensive, accessible kind of materials, and they were magically transformed by his hands and his imagination.
For years, the Fishers' growing collection was kept under wraps, hanging only in private galleries at the Gap headquarters in downtown San Francisco.
I think as the collection moved forward over the years, there was a sense that this would be a great legacy.
In 2007, 2 years before his death, Don Fisher made moves to secure a permanent home for his collection, his own private museum in the Presidio.
Well, I told him we wanted to have at least 50,000 square feet of exhibition space to be able to show our art. If everything went correctly, I'd hope that we could open in March of 2011.
But the plans to build the museum stalled after 2 years of opposition from neighborhood groups and environmental watchdogs. It was at that point that the Museum of Modern Art stepped in.
The Fisher family's been involved with this museum since the early 1980s. We began to talk seriously with Dawn and Doris about the possibility of their collection coming to the museum, and happily we were able to bring it all together.
But a gift of this size requires major construction. SFMOMA is planning to add 100,000 square feet of gallery and public space by 2016. They are proposing to tear down 2 buildings to the south and build a new wing to house the Fisher collection.
The understanding that they reached, I think, with the Fisher family was that some large fraction of it will always be in view, which will position the museum internationally really strongly, much more strongly than they've been positioned up to now.
It's a tremendous challenge because we don't want to just grow and get larger. We have to get larger in an intelligent way. How do we present the collection? What does it mean to come to this museum? How do we serve our visitors? We need to think about all these things, and not just a matter of building a new building and hanging more pictures on more walls.
What's more important to me is that the collection fills a gap in this museum's account of art history. The Fisher collection is heavily weighted towards minimalism and towards an East Coast sensibility. And a lot of that work was missed out here. So a new generation of artists who have never seen that material firsthand will get to really focus on it. Things like that are of inestimable value to SFMOMA's remaking of itself in the future.
The Fisher exhibition is part of SFMOMA's celebration of its 75th anniversary and will be on view until September 19th. Now to find out how technology is changing the way wine gets to your glass, let's go to Leslie Sbrocco for Food and Wine This Week.
Thanks, Belva. As a wine expert, I taste thousands of bottles of wine every year, and I've observed firsthand how technology has influenced winemaking. And now with the green movement in full swing, wineries are utilizing modern packaging techniques and updating some traditional methods for serving and storing wine. What's old is new again, and when it comes to wine, that's never more true than it is today. For centuries, wine has been transferred from the barrel to the bottle. Now, alongside traditional bottles with corks, are stainless steel canteens filled with simple, fresh young wine that's delivered weekly. And pressurized tanks supply wine on tap. Then it's back to the barrel that's inspired by the past for a new way to pour a glass. A new way that's almost as old as, well, wine itself. Joining me is KQED Radio and Bay Area Bites blogger, Cy Musiker, along with wine visionary Jean-Charles Boisset. Now, Jean-Charles, you come from one of the most traditional wine regions in the world, Burgundy in France, and now you're a Californian. And I think you're known in the industry for your focus on innovation, but really a focus on the environment. Now, how has that manifested itself in what you're doing with, for example, some of the wines that you brought today?
Well, I was very fortunate at a young age. My grandmother instilled in me the values of organic and biodynamic by really utilizing the galaxies in relationship to Mother Nature and Mother Earth, and really respecting the organics and biodynamics of our ecosystem. Then I wanted to take it to the next level, beyond making organic wines and biodynamic wines, moving into the package to really diminish the carbon footprint. Right. So we decided to do all kinds of innovation alongside to Tetra Pak, PET, aluminum bottles, as well as barrels.
And you brought Tetra Pak here today, and when we say Tetra Pak right there, it looks like a juice box, right?
It is, indeed.
Yeah.
It is really basically a carton with a little layer of aluminum inside. And this is great because this is 90% less packaging. This is actually lighter than an eggshell.
Right.
So the beauty of this is there's really more than 66%, ecosystem or a carbon footprint.
And you reduced our carbon footprint. The same is true with the PET bottles, right?
Same for both.
Right.
Exactly. This is resealable, easy to use, easy to carry, perfect for tailgating.
Right.
Same with PET, and you can conserve it for a longer period of time, which makes it fantastic.
And it's much lighter.
Yeah, and it's much lighter, and it looks like a bottle. That one is actually plastic right there.
And this one is 1 liter, so we have 33% more wine in it, which is fantastic as well for the consumer.
Still
too.
recyclable. Again,
Recyclable
lighter, so the
fully.
shipping costs are less, carbon footprint.
And 7 of those actually create a T-shirt. So your T-shirt is actually made out of those.
Out of 7 of those,
I'm
you're
more
recycled.
natural than that, but yes, that's right.
And let's talk a little bit, Sai, about the Wine on Tap movement in San Francisco.
Right. Well, there's the same kind of push for being greener, reducing your carbon footprint, and less waste in the restaurant business and bar business as there is at the winery side. And for restaurants, this has been always a big problem. What do you do with that last little bit of wine at the end of the day that's going to sit there overnight and often sits there and is poured for the next customer the next day and is stale and tired? That's a waste for the restaurant. And so what wine restaurants have done is, in fact, sometimes gone to wineries and said, let's find a way to package the wine in kegs like beer is, but without adding fizz. So they're using nitrogen or argon gas to cap wine in what are called ponies, which are these tall cylinders, and they can hold 5 gallons or more.
And the delivery
of
system
wine.
looks kind of like a beer on tap. I mean,
Right,
when you're
exactly. You pull a little lever, and the wine flows into the glass. And these are for the restaurants also. The opportunity is there to do something that they love to do, that these wine buyers love to do, create their own custom blends. So they can go to a winery. The winery then says, I don't have to bottle it. I don't have to design a label.
less waste,
Less waste.
cost.
Right, exactly. And it's very much a locavore kind of idea also. Chris Pastina at a Chop Bar in Oakland near Jack London Square, he actually wheels a dolly over to J.C. Cellars, Jeff Cohn's winery.
Jeff Cohn's winery does great
also
wine,
in downtown Oakland, and definitely no carbon footprint from that delivery system.
Yeah. And talk about your barrels, because again, it's that same idea of reducing waste in the restaurant business. If you're ordering wines by the glass, guess what? You don't really need it in the bottle. Sorry. So.
Well, what we wanted to try to do, and I say try because it's always a challenge, is to really replicate a tasting as if you were in the cellar. So we wanted to bring the cellar to the consumer. So by doing a barrel, it's a mini barrel which contains 10 liters of wine, unfined and unfiltered. We brought exactly the same experience to a consumer in Kentucky, in Illinois, in New York, as if they were in Sonoma. So we put the barrel on the bar, and it allows the sommelier, the wine steward, to say, do you want to taste an unfined and filtered wine as if you were at Deloge Vineyards? So what we attempted to achieve is really maintain quality, freshness, which is very, very important, as well as bring a wine nobody would ever try in a regular bottle of wine because of the unfined and filtered aspect of it. Brought into a 10-liter eco bag we slide inside, so you have the attraction of that sexy, tactile, really adorable barrel. Wine is, and the content is, so everybody asks, what is it in the barrel?
And I think you brought up an important point, which is quality of the wine. And you actually have a wine, we have your wine in barrel, from barrel here in our glass, but we also have an interesting wine. This is Sauvignon Blanc from a company that it also does unfined, unfiltered, very non-interventionist wine, the Natural Process Alliance. And they serve it in canteens, much like a milkman would bring the...
Well, exactly, and I think it's great. This is a little bit cloudy. It's hard to see on camera, but one of the things that they do is they limit, I believe, their delivery to within 100 miles of the winery. That's both to keep the efficiency of delivering to enough restaurants so that you're not wasting a lot of gasoline, but also this wine is not necessarily stable for weeks and weeks and weeks on end.
But it's the freshest and it's meant to be drunk and brought to... Well, I have to tell you, the future is very exciting for this, isn't it? So I want to thank you both for joining me, Jean-Charles Boisset and Sai Musiker. You'll find more information on this new trend, as well as a link to the Bay Area Bites blog. Just go to kqed.org/thisweek. And that's it for now. Until next time, Cheers, and cheers to you. Cheers. Thank you.
Well, that's all for tonight. We are taking a break for the holiday and will be off July 2nd and 9th, returning on July 16th with the best news and information worth sharing. Until then, you can visit kqed.org/thisweek to watch complete episodes and segments of our program, subscribe to our newsletter and podcasts, and share your thoughts about the show. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.
Major funding for Spark on This Week in Northern California is provided by Diane B. Wilsey. Additional funding provided by the George Frederick Jewett Foundation, Helen Sarah Steyer, and Fred Levin and Nancy Livingston of the Shenson Fund. Major funding for Quest on This Week in Northern California is provided by the National Science Foundation.